Namaste and in Lak'ech, and welcome to this episode of One World in a New World. I'm your host, Zen Benefiel, and this week's guest is Gregory Stebbins. He has a doctorate in education, is the founder of People Savvy and master coach. He is also in the Forbes Council of Coaching, and he has a recent book called Wise Leadership, Embracing Our Heart's Wisdom that is rising up the charts. He is a graduate of Pepperdine University with a doctorate in education, and I know we're going to have a fantastic conversation, so you'll want to stick around for it. We'll be right back.
Explore the thoughtless. Embark on a life-changing journey of self-discovery. Embrace harmony with self, with others, with Earth. One world in a new world. Zen Benefiel skillfully ignites conversations, guiding guests to reveal personal journeys and perspectives. Listeners are inspired to seek knowledge and find wisdom in their own lives. Join this transformative journey as we navigate the depth of human experience.
Greg, it's so great to have you here. I've been looking forward to this conversation. I know we're going to get into the depths of awareness and reality and connectivity. So I really appreciate, especially with your background, this is going to be a phenomenal conversation. Thank you.
My pleasure. And I feel the same with you, Zen. We've been dancing around the edges of each other, and now we get a chance to really play.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So, when, as we talked about before, that's what I hope to do is bridge the gap between inner and outer realities for people in ways that are practical and pragmatic. However, that means we got to talk about the weird stuff, right? And it's not so weird. It's just that we're seen that way because we're bereft of having these conversations about our inner world and our experiences that are so important and actually create our outer world. Truth be known, I believe, and I think you do too. So in your early stages, how did you first get connected with this notion of things being interconnected?
Well, it's an interesting process. As I was, talking with you before we started this interview, when I was about 16, my mom was buying me Gene Dixon books. So I started to get interested in that. And she just knew. I don't know how she knew, but she just knew.
Absolutely. Well, what's strange though is that, in that further, as you expressed a little bit of background in it, that you grew up in a military family and the history of your father, grandfather, great-grandfather, and probably great-great-grandfather were all West Point graduates.
Yeah.
And so you've got this really strict command and control environment that you're in, and your mom's giving you Gene Dixon books. That's just phenomenal.
Yeah. Well, I don't think she ever told my dad about that, but
Well, back then, probably not. There were
yeah,
those,
just to keep peace in
separate
the family.
relationships.
Yeah. So when I was about 17, I started to learn to meditate. And, when I say learn to meditate, I just started doing stuff. And then when I went away to college, in the middle of my sophomore year, I met some people who were studying with a guy named John Roger. And I started learning how to meditate for real at that time. So that was about 1970.
What were the adjustments? I mean, I know I've done a lot of stuff. I'm self-taught for the most part, as you probably are as well. When you had that shift from your own practice to a disciplined practice, what were the differences that you noticed?
Well, here's the interesting part. When I turned 18, I had a complete change of consciousness. When I was growing up, it was expected my brother and I would either go to West Point or the Air Force Academy because my dad was part of the Army Air Corps, which became the Air Force.
Mm-hmm.
And I had a complete change in consciousness, and I was like, no, I'm not going to go shoot somebody. So I went down to the draft board and said, I want to file a consciousness objector. And the woman behind the counter looked at me and said, you'll never get it. I said, okay. She said, but if you didn't get it, would you go to Canada? I said, no, I'd stay and do my service. If it meant cleaning bedpans, I'd do that. What I didn't know was that really touched her she locked my file in the safe. And when she finally retired in the early 1980s, she said, "Oh, there's some old files in there. You might as well just throw them away." So it wasn't just me. She had made the decision that, some of the kids from the airbase I was on had made a decision not to be part of it, and they had served their time. And, growing up in my family, yeah, I spent the first 18 years of my life in the military.
Hmm.
So, um, but I started learning how to meditate for real. And then in the middle of my junior year, I just dropped out of college and moved to Los Angeles to study more closely with my teacher at the time. And
Hmm.
he told me, he said, "You're out here for two reasons. One is to study spiritual stuff, and the second is to get your degree." And I went, "Oh, okay."
Yes, sir. Right.
Yeah. So I went back to school, I got my bachelor's degree, and then it came forward I should get a master's degree. So I got a master's degree from USC in finance, of all things. Uh, and then I was at a gas station filling up my car. He pulls up in his car and he's filling up, and we're talking back and forth. And he talks about this university that he was founding. And he tells me all about it. And then he starts to get in his car and he sort of looks at me and says, "You really ought to think about getting a doctorate." And just runs off.
Sure.
So the next day, I'm looking at schools in Los Angeles about getting a doctorate. So, which I did. I finally did that. And
That's a lot of work. And it's,
yeah,
there's a lot of folks that would say, bah, but really the discipline, the effort, the strenuous mental activity, let alone, the hours of study, that says a lot. you know,
well,
and I don't think people are that disciplined and passionate about life today.
yeah, they're not. But it actually was more work than you think because at that time, there was a community center that a lot of us lived at. And there was a requirement of 20 hours a week of contributing to
Mhm.
the upkeep of the community center. And just to make sure I had enough money to do all this, I worked full time.
I know it that I went through two master's degrees in business.
Yeah. So,
Working.
you understand that your social life sucks.
Oh yeah. What social life?
Yeah, exactly. I heard about that one time.
Yeah, exactly.
So, I was doing all these things and I was pretty much progressing with my spiritual studies, but it was more like stealth. I didn't really talk about it to too many people, except on a rare occasion where spirit would come in and say, "You need to talk about this with this person." So at the time I was working for a company called ADP, Automatic Data Processing.
Hmm.
And I was sitting
They're
there,
huge.
yeah, I was sitting there in a room preparing accounts receivable reports. There's a guy sitting behind me, and Spirit just comes in like you talked about and just blasts him.
Now, what was that like? All right, because this is where people have difficulty in trusting those inner promptings when they come, because
Well,
they are kind of
he
weird.
was ready for it. It just is, it just wasn't time to talk about it with him because he'd ask me questions ever so often. He was aware, but
No, I
when
was talking about the prompting within you, right? These are the things that I hope to share with others that, because there's this resistance because it's a different world inside, right? And
well,
that
but
prompting that's unquestionable or and undeniable that it happens, yet what does it happen? What was it like for you? Was it um, just this impetus? Was it an actual voice? Was there just a knowing that arrived or
it was more of an energetic pattern and just a knowing. But
okay.
I've had that knowing since I was a kid.
Yeah, I think we all do. We just deny it.
Yeah.
We're all inextricably connected and we've just been in denial.
But because my mother
And we
was,
weren't swimming.
yeah, because I was, my mother was so, like I said, Swami Mommy.
Yeah.
it was a natural part for me. It didn't seem strange. It didn't seem weird. And when I was playing basketball in high school, um, she'd always ask me before a game, okay, who's going to win? And I would tell her, you know, because the information would come forward.
Sure.
And so,
Ask questions. What was it? Ask, seek, and knock, one guy said, and you'll get the answers. You just
well,
got
I'd be
to.
playing the game, and it's like you talk about a voice. I would hear a voice say, "You need to back off and let the other guys on the team score because they're really focused on you." And so I did
Now,
that.
that's servant leadership.
Yeah, and the coach, of course, hated it. And when my brother was playing, because he was a year older, we'd been playing basketball together so much that we didn't have to look at each other.
Yeah.
And so I'd reach up like this and grab the ball because he had just passed it to me, but I wasn't looking at him. And the coach he just could not understand that. And it just was too weird for him. So I
Hmm.
didn't do anything about it.
Well, yeah, you grew up like that. I was in sports in school too. I had some close friends that we developed not quite that relationship, but pretty close. And you don't think about it at the time,
Oh,
right? It just
oh,
happens. It's natural. It's part of your experience. You don't
yeah.
question.
And so when you ask, well, what did it feel like when this thing came in? It was like it was very natural for me. And he was just,
Let me
he,
ask you one more question while we're in
okay.
eruption, because I think it's important because you're one of the few people I believe that really could go into the depths of this answer. And when you have that, what's the sensation in your body? Where is it? The indigenous have this three brain system, the gut, the heart, and the head, and we generally process the opposite direction. Were you that sensitive that you would feel these impressions somewhere in your body as
It
well?
would,
Or was
it
it
wouldn't
just,
necessarily be an energetic for me. It would just be a sense of knowing.
okay?
So you know what was going on, and then you would respond appropriately based on what was going on.
And that knowing wasn't necessarily in your head, it was
No,
in your entire being.
right.
Okay.
At
Right.
that point, you're in a state of being, not a state of doing.
Yes.
You might be doing stuff, but you're really in a state of
Well,
doing.
we get into a lot of doo-doo that way, right?
Yeah, I know, but it is what it is.
Yeah.
So he was struggling with this because it had him pinned to the seat. And all I could do was turn around and smile and say, it kind of builds up, doesn't it? And he's like, and he finally got enough saying, you know what's going on? Yes, I do. Seen this before, experienced it myself. Yeah. So, and we're still good friends to this day. But,
Oh, good.
that's
Nice when you can give a person who is in that state of quasi confusion that, oh yeah, it's okay. Let me hold your hand. We'll get through this.
being as empathic and compassionate as you can
Yeah.
to let them know that this is just part of the process and it's just the beginning of the process. And you get a choice. You get to choose in or choose out. You
Right.
know, there's no mandatory part of this.
No, there isn't, and that's the maybe the quandary that folks have is when, and I had this with my wife Luba, because I use the word submission a lot.
Hmm.
And to one who was raised in the Soviet Union, that's not a good word.
Yeah.
So there's these trigger words that we have to navigate with because, there's this, it's an acquiescence, I think, is where I went to with that. That's the most suitable um, to just
Well,
embrace it.
interesting that you use those words. I use the word acceptance.
Hmm.
And acceptance doesn't mean you acquiesce to it. It means that you're accepting as part of what's going on.
True.
You still get to choose whether you're going to participate or not.
Hmm.
And what I found in my life is when I choose, the life pattern moves very smoothly.
Absolutely.
The few times I've chosen not to, things get a little rough. But it's like, hey, you chose that. So
Right. Well, hopefully there's not too many cosmic two-by-fours you get slapped upside the head with before you actually get right.
Well, the question is, when you get slapped upside the head, are you really aware of that?
True. Well, because those are the situations where you've fallen out of alignment
Yeah,
so much that you cause harm to yourself.
those are two great words to put together. Acceptance results in alignment.
Yeah,
So, and a lot of that has been the focus of my life. How do I stay in alignment? How do I keep aligned? How do I make sure that I'm doing the things that are necessary to do while I'm still dabbling in the world and having my experiences and doing all the stuff that
sure.
really is a waste
And
of
you're kind
time.
of sharing a joyful noise as a result of that, right? Because it's so exciting. It's so um, awe-inspiring that it you got to have it, right? You know it's there. It's that part of life that just continually accelerates and ascends your own
Yeah.
activity.
So then I did a bunch of different things. Came forward that I was part of the university that was beginning. We put some classes together, and then I had dinner with JR, and it was clear to him that he wanted a program, not necessarily a bunch of classes. So
Hmm.
we put the university on hiatus. He got two people from New Mexico that were very good at it, had doctorates in psychology, and he put together a psychological kind of program. And I continued to act as treasurer for the university, just to keep my hand in. Uh, and then I left to do other things, and it came about that there's a program called Insight Seminars. And I was
Yes.
very much involved in that from the very beginning. And at that point in time, I was on the board and we were discussing, that we really should have a more formalized education. I said, why don't we put together Insight University? He said, well, none of us know how to do that. I said, yeah, I might have some clues.
Yeah.
So I called a friend of
It was
mine.
within your reach, right? And this
Yeah,
is
yeah,
what I love about the organizational acuity, if you will, of spirit, for lack of a better. It organizes things. It gathers people. I find when you're where you put your attention with intention and you're interacting with that, it's like a momentum tunnel that just draws people to it.
yeah. So I had actually created a consulting company probably in 1989 and was had a lot of clients and was doing a lot of consulting and this kind of thing threw its thing on my doorstep. And I called a friend of mine in New Mexico who had formed a university himself. And so I was talking to him. He had just created a doctorate program in transformational leadership. I was
Mhm.
looking at a master's program in transformational leadership. So we got together, we started talking, and I said, if we try to do both at the same time, it's going to kill us, you know, because it's tough to put those programs together.
Oh yeah, any kind of curriculum development is tough.
Yeah. So we chose the doctorate program. We got the program up and running, and in New Mexico, you had to be accredited within 3 years, which is just a hump. So I was working with some people who help universities go through accreditation process. And then the Secretary of Education changed the world because we had a blended learning program. Some of it was online, and a lot of it was we would meet as a class once a semester for 4 days.
Hmm.
But it was an intense 4 days.
No doubt.
But the Secretary of Education put forward these regulations for which there was no legislation that basically said if you have any online programs, you must make sure that the students, wherever you have a student or wherever you have faculty, that you're registered in that state as if you were an in-state school.
Wow.
Yeah. So
That's like,
my registration fees in New Mexico were about $1,000 a year. The new regulation caused the registration fees to look like going to $3 million a year. For example, Massachusetts wouldn't even talk to you until you wrote a check for $10,000 and then they sit down and talk to
that's just horrible. Hearing that
you.
about education, it's, turned into a money maker rather than actually delivering education. That's
And
horrible. And
that actually wasn't the worst.
I can imagine that's just the beginning because the trickle down is where the
The,
damage really occurs.
the state of Texas sent me a letter saying if any of your students happen to be residents in Texas and they graduate, they could be criminally liable. For what? Getting an education? So all these things just pointed out that time to close the tent down.
Yeah, and figure out how to make some adjustments if that is
Yeah,
even possible. You know, the you're so you've got this curriculum. I can relate to the curriculum development too. I taught high school and I had two charter schools. I had full charge of the high school curriculums
yeah.
and the four grades, right? That was just and but I had some fun with it too. I built multiple intelligence learning centers. And just because I thought, okay, let's see what we can do, right? I didn't know. I've never heard that I were even possible. I just figured, okay, we know this now. Why not implement it?
We actually graduated two classes before I shut down the university. I just could not generate, one of the board members said, if we got you $5 million, would you continue? I said, no, because it'd be gone in 2 years. And none of it will go to being educating the students. It would just be registration fees.
Right.
And he goes, oh, okay. It's like, what are you going to do? So,
Well, what can you do? That's a great question. What are you going to do? And this is what spurred both of us, I believe, to go down the paths that we have for change and attempting to right a listing ship, if you will.
yeah. So a lot of what I've been doing in preparation, and some of which had been part of the university, was really getting an understanding of wisdom development.
Hmm.
And and then the other part of it was this whole concept of transcendent leadership was starting to come forward, which is the next layer up from transformational leadership. So if you look at the word transcend, it's raised to a higher level.
Right.
Uh,
Right. What was, if we could kind of not divert, but go off on a tangent a little bit, kind of what's transformational leadership in, if you could put that succinctly, what does that mean?
Well, it's been defined by lots of different people, and each definition is a little different, but it's like you go through a process of transformation. But if you're leading an organization, the organization goes through a process, and hopefully all the individuals go through a process.
Well, yeah, you're the spearhead, so you're leading the way, and it's going to at least somehow ripple through the
So
rank
if
and
you,
file.
if you look at leadership development from like the turn of the last century, 1800s to 1900s,
Hmm.
before the 1900s, it was called the great man theory because only men were leaders and only great men could be leaders. Okay.
Right.
Fortunately, we're beyond that. Then in the 1920s, it became transactional. You work for me, you produce X widgets, you get paid. Okay. And,
Right.
and there's still companies out today that operate on a transactional basis and they do really well.
Well, yeah, and that's kind of what Dewey set up with our educational system initially, the factory workers.
Yeah. So um, then when humanistic psychology came to the forefront in the 1950s, the whole concept of transformation started coming out. One of the fathers of transformational psychology was Abraham Maslow.
Hmm.
Okay, so all of this became a whole different way to look at education, and especially a whole different way to look at leadership. And so that's what we were teaching. But as we were teaching it, we got this clue that, there's a higher level on this.
Sure.
So I went back to Maslow just before he passed in 1969, 1970. He had written a paper on transcendence. The beginning of that paper probably may happen when he was co-facilitating a program in the early 1960s with the name just jumped out of my head, but the guy who survived the German concentration camps.
Oh gosh. Um, the word that came to mind was Priaf Copper, but that's not the one. Anyway,
Yeah.
in
So,
that name will come in just a little bit. It'll
of
come out of
course,
nowhere.
yeah, of course. It's like, I'm sorry, my brain is going, file not found.
Yeah. Well, unimportant at this point. Um,
So that became that, and then it was quiet. And then a paper was written by a doctoral candidate in a school up in Washington on transcendent leadership. And then various papers started showing up in the early 2000 and that type of thing. I wrote a book on it and it published it in 2020 on transcendent leadership. And I've gotten a lot of people around the world who've read the book and really want more depth and more information on that. And so if you use the word transcendent, which means to rise above, what does it mean for a person to rise above all of these lower levels of consciousness and move into a higher level of consciousness?
that's almost apocalyptic now, isn't it?
Yeah, yeah,
Because it's the uncovering. This is one thing that I really find puzzling today is that 99% of the people think apocalypse is a catastrophic end of the earth, right?
no,
That's not what the word means. It means uncovering knowledge.
yeah. Well, it depends on culture you bring in. Okay,
Well,
so
it's absolutely, however, tracing it to the roots, the Greek, it
okay, yeah.
means take the lid off, right? So,
Well, part of transcendent leadership is a whole process called reverence.
yes,
If you look at reverence from the Jewish perspective, it means bow down to God. But if you look at it from the Greek perspective, it means a sense of awe, where you look at what's going on and you go, "Wow!"
right.
And that's where
And then
that,
you ask questions, right?
yeah,
Like, how'd
exactly.
that happen? I want more.
Yeah, you'll get more when you can handle it.
Yeah, yeah, that's the interesting
Otherwise, we
thing
burn
about it.
everything out. So that started coming on, and that's the whole process of wisdom development precedes that transcendence. And wisdom to me is an integration of mind, hunch, head, hunch, and heart. So your knowledge base, your non-linear understanding, the knowing base, and the heart, which a lot of people, even today in corporations, have a really hard time with that.
Oh, and don't even talk about love,
Yeah.
workplace, right? Or instituting something, loving and being loved and all that kind of conversation. It was like, whoa.
Well, that's primarily because most people have the word love geared up to relationships,
Yep.
and they know that relationships are not to be done. They get pounded by human resources for that.
Oh, sure. And they
But
get messy.
but caring about a person is actually a demonstration of love.
Absolutely.
So I'll give you an example. A client of mine, the CEO, he will remain nameless, was changing the direction of his company. He had a whole different strategic vision. And all of his senior executives had bought onto it except for the CFO. And the CFO was just becoming a plug in the piping.
Yeah. Didn't see the numbers in it.
Yeah. And so he said, I don't know what to do. I said, as a CFO, you can always trade him out. And he looks at me and says, Greg, I can't do that. I said, why not? He said, he's my best friend. In fact, he was my best man at my wedding. I said, so you feel a little trapped. What would you do if you really, really did love this guy? He said, I'd probably go find him a job at a company that was perfect for him. I said, great idea. Why don't you do that? And that's what he did. He went and talked to all of his other CEO buddies, and he found a perfect job for this guy, transferred him over. The guy just absolutely loves his new job because it fits in his wheelhouse. And he
Mhm.
went and got a different CFO that was in alignment with his plans. To me, that's unconditional loving. But if you use
Well,
those
yeah,
words, for most senior executives, they go, well, no, he was just taking care of the person. Right. That's what loving is taking care of.
exactly. You give of yourself to the other in order to make their lives better.
Yeah. And so if you're really talking about that part of the heart, you're talking about self-compassion, self-empathy, and self-loving.
Mhm.
It doesn't have anything to do with anybody else. It has to do with yourself.
Right.
So when I'm working with people to take them through the wisdom development process, there's two things that they need to do. One is they need to do self-inquiry to really understand what their experiences have been and what the learning is from the experience and whether they've learned from the experience or not. Most people do self-inquisition instead. They just beat themselves up.
Well, yeah, self-deprecation. Of the 70,000 thoughts
Yeah.
we have a day, I would venture to say three-fourths of them are self-deprecating, if not more.
Well, actually, they tested this. There's a study that took place in really young kids.
Oh, goody statistics. I love it.
Yeah, and they found out that the common feedback that they got as students, 95% of it was what you couldn't do.
Yeah. Well,
So, like you take a
let me key
spelling
off
test.
that a second, because I had an experience in college. I'll just share it really briefly when I had first opened to telepathy and didn't know it, right? I'm coming back. I worked in the cafeteria, lived in the honors dorm that was 50 yards away. I'm walking from the cafeteria to the honors dorm one day, and I'm passing other students, and I hear all of this self-deprecation, you this, you that, you the other, all, and I'm thinking I'm hearing it, and you is me. And I'm like, whoa, where did this come from? And it wasn't my voice.
Yeah.
I locked myself in my dorm room for a couple of days. And finally, a friend comes over and he says, What's going on? Where you been? And he and I had been doing some experiments together. So we were much more open. And I said, Well, here's what happened. He says, Well, were those your voice? Was that your voice or others? And at that point, I went, Oh shit. Right.
Yeah.
And yet, here it is. So if we have that capacity, man, we open up, you really got to be careful what you listen to.
Well, think about the non-vocal feedback you get, even in grade school. So
Yeah.
you take a spelling test and you get 95 out of 100 words spelled correctly. The score on the paper says -5 and it's in red.
Yep.
So once they get past the self-inquiry phase, then it's a process of self-reflection, except that most people do self-rejection, as you say,
Mhm.
you know. And so
Which creates the chaos in their lives.
exactly. So one of the things I found in working with various executives in terms of helping them develop wisdom is the senior executives don't want to do it. Why? Because it means they got to go and look at all this stuff that they beat themselves up for years, and they just don't want to do that. The emerging leaders or the brand new leaders who are just desperate to learn everything they can about leadership, they dive into it
Sure.
and
So
go,
so is this generational
no,
or is it transcendent into just the intention and the choices that folks are making?
I think it's a bigger issue, Zen. I think it's more the evolution of mankind.
Thank you for bringing that up.
Yeah, as you know, and I think that's why you and I and a lot of other people, our real job is just to help mankind evolve.
Yes.
And so part of that evolution is some people are really willing to get into it, wake up, become aware. And self-awareness is so huge in both transformational and especially transcendent leadership.
Right.
You don't have that self-awareness, it's going to be difficult.
Well, in that self-awareness, you become aware that how you think, feel, believe does produce the reality of which you experience. Now, how do we get that through the thick-headedness in humanity and bring them to a new state of being gently, if possible? Because this ride isn't always gentle, although it can be with proper help.
Well, a person, this is a very general statement. A person is a summation of their experiences and how they've wired those experiences up.
Right.
Okay. So in corporate trainings, there's a huge thing on emotional intelligence.
Hmm.
Most of the leaders go to the intelligence part of emotion and still will not feel their emotions.
Right.
Okay. And so that's part of the experience. What were your emotions? Well, emotions are negative. Are they? So I say, look at them. Have you ever gotten angry at something? Oh, yeah, I've gotten angry with people. Great. Okay. So what boundary did the other person cross that caused that emotion to appear? And what have you done to become more aware of those boundaries and which ones are appropriate for where you are, or might just be plugged in when you were getting programmed as a kid? And then that's when the wisdom moment happens, where the light bulb turns on.
Yeah, it's like,
Okay, so
and those are great to see, and they're visible when that happens too, aren't
yeah, yeah. So every emotion is like that.
they?
There's
Yeah.
a hidden gem in that if you take the time to really look into it. But I use anger because it's such a common emotion.
Everybody has it.
Yeah, yeah. So and those boundaries get programmed in from 0 to 7 years old, where you go through an imprinting process.
Mhm.
And then
Now,
from 7 to 13, you go through a modeling process. The house next door has workmen pounding away. So you look for a hammer in your, kitchen drawer, and you look for a board to pound on, usually the dining room table. Not all modeling efforts are successful. Or your parents want to give you a sense of culture, so they take you to an art gallery. You get home, search out your box of 64 Crayolas and look for a blank canvas, usually the dining room wall. Again, not all modeling efforts are successful.
right.
Then from about 14 to 21, you go through a process where you rewire all the stuff that your parents have told you, your friends' parents, your church, your school, whatever's programmed in, you go in and you test it. And usually when I'm doing a seminar, uh, I'll look at people and say, okay, so you have kids in that age range, right? So how did you know? Because you're missing large chunks of hair.
Well, and even with this, I love this 14 to 21, right? So this is that crux space, I guess, for lack of a better, that for the imprinting to take hold or transcend. I was one of the fortunate ones, even though I was adopted, not even though, because I was, and I was given a much better life than I could have had. My father was a 32nd degree Mason, so he introduced me to DeMolay
Right.
as I went into high school. And this was just, it made sense. It felt real. The instruction, the precepts, the value of uh, for life and others.
Yeah. So that provides a great foundation for which you springboard off of.
Yeah.
You have to understand that a lot of people don't have that foundation. All they've gone through is just here's what's been imprinted, here's what I tested,
Right.
here's what I modeled. And when you model stuff, you get your parents' approval. Yes, that's a good model. No, that's not the thing to do. And as you said, 90% of what feedback you get is no, that's not a good thing to do.
Right.
So you're kind of
Well,
left with,
and in that process, you don't think about as a leader, right? Initially, you're not aware of all this imprinting. And because you are in a leadership position, your imprinting has been much different. And we tend to think everybody's the same as us.
so growing up where I grew up, and my father and the other family members being officers in the military, we were expected to be leaders.
Hmm.
My dad never talked about it, just there was this expectation that we would be leaders.
Yeah. There
In
was
the,
this, the vibe was right.
yeah, in the Boy Scout troop, we were leaders of the Boy Scout troop, that kind of stuff. And
Yeah.
it's part of, people say, well, when did you learn leadership? I said, probably started learning it when I was about 3 days old, because it just got imprinted.
Okay.
And the other part that I didn't tell you about growing up,
Oh, I like that pause. Says like, do I want to say this or not? Right?
yeah. So I told you when I was 18, I had a change of consciousness.
Yes.
Part of the change of consciousness was to go down to the draft board and file for conscientious objector.
Hmm.
And the woman behind the draft board saying, you'll never get it. And by the way, if you don't get it, you're going to go to Canada. I said, no, I'm going to stay here and do my service. If it means cleaning bedpans, that's what I do.
And so the file ends up in the safe.
Yeah. So she puts the filing in the safe. And from that point on, instead of a 2S deferment, I get a 1H deferment, which is a holding category. No one understood what a holding category is. Usually it means we've lost your file, but we're not going to admit that. So when she retires in the 1980s, she said, oh, there's some old files in the safe. You might as well just clean them out, you know. And I didn't know it, but my mom found out about it and sent me the article. She said, if you ever wondered why you didn't get drafted, and my draft number, which you can relate to, was 101.
Ooh.
So it was a very low number.
Yep.
But life is like that, I was meant to do other things, and that's how it came through.
Now, do you feel from that statement, life was not meant to be that way for you? Do you find that there's this thread of being led to the greater being that you are? I've always had trouble articulating this because I believe that there is a design within us that there, if we have this natural order, we have this infinite intelligence that has constructed this reality in such an infinitesimally specific way, that the order there that if we're designed, if we're children of, if we're fashioned after, then what is this combination of genetic material and soul vibration, if you will, consciousness? How does this all fit? Does it? And what might it lead to?
So if we are all souls, which in my wheelhouse we are,
Hmm.
and before we incarnate, we write the game plan
Hmm.
with the powers that be. So this is all laid out. And in that game plan, you have different paths that you can take because you have choice.
Sure.
So my job is to make sure that I stay with the mandatory game plan and not take too many side trips. God knows I love side trips because it's
I do too. They're wonderful.
fun and that kind of stuff.
Yeah, yeah.
And you get to be irresponsible.
And meet cool people.
Yeah. So so that's pretty much hardwired in me, and I know that. And so pretty much everything I've done has been, this is up, time for you to do this. So the book that I just wrote, Wise Leadership, Embracing our heart's wisdom, that was laid out for me about 3 years ago. It took me that long to write the book.
Interesting timing. COVID, right?
Yeah.
We were talking about this prior to that. COVID, however it happened, with the sequestration, it gave everybody the chance to self-examine.
Well, not only that, I had been living in California, except for the 5 years I was in Santa Fe, New Mexico, doing Insight University. But I've
Mhm.
been living in California since '72. So my wife came to me and she said, my parents are beginning to age out. I'd like to go back and be there for them, which meant going to Green Bay, Wisconsin, which is where we live now.
Hmm.
And hey, she let me,
Go Packers.
yeah, she let me tag along. How cool was that? And
Yeah,
before you ask, I have been gifted a cheesehead. So, so that happened at the end of 2020, right when COVID was coming out. So my whole world turned upside down.
sure. Along with everybody else's for the
Yeah,
time.
exactly. So, uh, but I
But you
kind of,
navigated. So here's the difference that instead of succumbing, you rose up, right?
yeah,
Where many people got into this fear-based mentality and rightfully so, perhaps, right? My wife and I was like, this feels like bullshit, right? So we never paid attention to anything. We lived our lives just like we normally would, and both of our businesses increased. Now, then we looked around and we'd go out, and people be wearing masks everywhere, driving down the street in their car wearing a mask. How ridiculous.
yeah. Well, you tell
Sorry, that
people,
was a little my bias there.
no, but you know, truth is coming out.
Yeah.
It's taking a while, but it's coming out. So, um, I had a different environment. I had the time to really focus on this. I had the time to collect all the learning because I've been studying wisdom stuff for probably 20 years or more.
Mhm.
And, I'm people who know me know I'm just a voracious reader.
Oh, and you're driven to know what's valuable, not from an economic sense, although that does happen as a result. You're looking for what's valuable in the connection of people, places, and things, and how they can work together better and people savvy, right?
Yeah. So, and doing those three things, I've become more or less an expert on transcendent leadership, wise leadership, and loving leadership. What I refer to as the trifecta of
Sure.
where leadership is going.
Well, and the Trinity applies everywhere. I think it's the most ubiquitous pattern in the universe. We've got the Trinity in pretty much every organized religion. Um, doesn't matter. And then at a micro level, you've got a proton, electron, and neutron.
Yeah.
And it's like here we are. Can we not see where did that originate? How did this trickle through and how do we apply the understanding and wisdom that comes through the discovery of that?
Well, you got to be willing to look at your experiences and understand the learning from those experiences and just take it as a learning, not as a uh,
No
it,
failures.
yeah,
There are no failures. They're just all stepping stones. It's that goes back into that self-deprecation mode as opposed to
yeah,
self-acceptance.
yeah. So, but if you've been programmed to not have that, your first action will be not to have that,
Right.
and then they wonder why they keep repeating the same experience over and over, simply because you have not learned from it yet.
Right.
So, the whole concept of learning organizations is like, yeah, but what level of organization, what level of learning are you doing? It's one thing to learn the skills of being leadership, and it's another thing to learn who you are as a leader.
Mhm.
So, and a lot of leaders don't understand that who they are as a leader shows up long before they physically show up.
Well, sure, it's visible to everybody.
Yeah.
Uh, and it's internal, right? It's based on here I'm making some assertions. It's based on that sense of awe, curiosity, and willingness to step into where you're being prompted to go.
Yeah. But it's you prompting you to go there because you're the one who wrote the script.
Right.
And you
Yeah,
know.
and that's the self-love. That's the connection. This is what I was talking about, that internal design that's there that we've been, I don't want to say unwilling, we just haven't had the awareness to look at it yet until perhaps when quantum physics arrived.
A friend of mine had a nice expression. You know, denial is more than just a river in Egypt. Yeah,
Very
this,
much. I
it,
made a swimming concept or comment earlier about denial. How do we get through this? What have you found that excel yeah, accelerates? Because we're in a time, we have time. That's the time. There's this sense of urgency and yet not, right? Because universe is, creation is going to go on just as it is, with or without us. Doesn't really matter. However, in this evolution of humanity, there's a Valentina Morovina is a Russian academician that got her title. That's the highest Academy of Sciences title in Russia.
Mhm.
She got her title through a dissertation called The Global Mutation in Humanity. And my wife shared this with me. It's in Russian, of course, but it's got English subtitles. She's had 10 years of study in the genetic shifts that have been taking place as part of this ascension. And the results are just, they're proving that, yes, consciousness is rising. Now, how do we apply that? How do we accept that? How do we move into it in better fashion so that we can move forward and in the preparation, if not the demonstration of loving and being loved, and harmony among people and planet resolving as the
Well,
process emerges?
people have to begin learning to accept the differences. So let me give you an example.
Sure.
People who have 5 fingers and a thumb, essentially they have 6 digits. It's not that unusual. But often if a baby is born that way, the single digit, the extra digit is removed. So there are already instances of, can you imagine what the span for piano with some of the 6 digits would be?
Wow. That I mean, Rachmaninoff had huge hands, but
Yeah,
imagine if he had
yeah,
six
exactly.
fingers on him. Oh,
But we must make them normal so they can be accepted as kids.
yeah.
So that's one of the things that draws us back is lack of acceptance of change, especially change that is like too weird or too strange. I can't wrap my head around it. So uh, I'll give you an example, and hopefully I'm not stepping on her toes too much. My sister
Okay.
became an Episcopal priest, and now she's the bishop in the state of Montana.
Good for
But there,
her.
but there are people in Montana that do not like what's going on. Where you're marrying gay guys and you have women as priests. How could you possibly do that? And of course, some of these cowboys have taken up the idea that we need to eliminate some of these folks. So she's hypersensitive about it,
Hmm.
and justifiably so. But that is an example of lack of acceptance of change.
Well,
So
this is one of the things where the peace organization that I'm involved with, Live and Let Live, the legal principle, don't aggress.
right.
As long as people are living their lives in peace and they're not aggressing toward others, let them be, right? And if you want that right, to live your life, to love, to honor, to spend whatever, to control your property, nobody else has anything to say about it, then you need to extend that to others as well.
And if you look at the rest of the world where people don't have those rights, at the very beginning, what they do to adapt to
Hmm.
that organization. Um, there's a great book written. We actually assigned it as reading. It was called Why Nations Fail. And it looked at the government structure of nations that just could not get out of poverty. Typically, it was because there was a very strong leader, and it would happen at an agricultural level. They needed to feed their troops, so they would go in and take control of the food sources,
Mm.
and the rest of the population would starve. So people who were farmers and kept having their crops stolen moved to the mountains and grew just enough crops to feed themselves. So they basically chose out of the system to take care of themselves.
And now we've got big farm that's feeding the military all over the world.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. So, you know, um,
I don't know if that's true or not, but the analogy is probably appropriate.
oh, I think it's probably very true. Very true.
When you think about it, and we don't realize what's our in the U.S. military budget is about 7 trillion, something like that. And in without realizing it, the American economy is running off that defense budget.
Yeah. Although you
That's a
need
hard pill to swallow.
you need to know that things are changing because even in West Point, they have classes on transformational leadership.
Hmm.
They have the whole command and control structure has changed. So it's leadership in small groups or small platoons.
Hmm.
And so this concept of there's a general that makes all the decisions and the shit rolls downhill. A lot of that's changed because people have realized that the guy who's out in the front lines knows more than what's going on back in headquarters.
Right. I'd met a general that was in charge of, um, oh gosh, what was the term? Anyway, this was in Iraq and in that area, and he was in charge of I want to say, emotional health of the troops.
Yeah,
I forget what the office was called, but here was a general that was charged with supporting his troops, um, not just inspirationally, but in that educational, here's where we're at, what we're doing. Let's treat each other with respect. We're not here to necessarily, go to war. We're here to evolve a situation into better order. Now, how would you suspect that this shift in the military and recognizing that there's an evolution of humanity taking place and what that might look like in the future, because R&D is 10, 15 years out, uh, at least. Um, Not so much anymore with the advent of computers, right? It's 6 to 9 months or something like that. However, when you're looking at the change of populations and the distribution systems and things like that, do you see those early indicators that there's a possibility that we can shift away from a war economy?
yeah, absolutely. I can give you an example.
Good.
Um, I would always, I, for I don't know how many years, I would go back to West Point with my father for his class reunions.
Hmm.
And so I was in the stands when the superintendent was giving his introductory lecture. His most prominent point was a recent West Point grad in Iraq after Iraq II, looking at what they could do to make the world a little better for them. They found out that where the farmers grew crops and where the processing plant was, there was no road there. So he took some of his troops, built a road, and now the farmers could sell their crops very easily to the processing plant. The processing plant would never shut down because they had more than enough food to process. So that's an example of an entirely different consciousness
Hmm.
we're talking about, which is, from my perspective, it's a loving consciousness because you're taking care of people.
Right. And there doesn't need to be any aggression in that. Um,
Well, there was aggression. They had to have defense people because there were still people in Iraq who were still trying to.
oh, sure, sure. But this was self-defense. It wasn't aggression.
Yeah,
The
yeah,
big difference between the two.
yeah. So a lot of people don't understand that when you're developing your wisdom, you got to be very clear about boundaries
Hmm.
and be very vocal about the boundaries that you have.
Even to the point of your thoughts, the distractions in your sphere. And, it's like, I think I'm able to do a lot in a little bit of time. And I've never really understood how I could do that. And then somebody says, wow, how do you do this? You're like, and I'm like, huh, I eliminate distractions.
Yeah, you focus.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
And micro moments, right? When you're doing something, oftentimes you're giving it to somebody else and you got to wait.
yeah,
If you're giving it to a computer and it's got to process, or you're giving it to another person, they have to process. Well, what do you do in that downtime? Do you sit and wait, or do you find something else? And I find this in project management that every activity has a cycle. It has a rhythm. And if you catch it at the right points where you nudge it to its next level, that's all you need to do. And you can have all kinds of things going on simultaneously as a result.
well, I think you've got a point there in terms of what I refer to as wise leaders, is they
Yeah.
know cycles, they know how the cycles interact with each other, and they know the inflection point of each of those cycles.
Well, how did you find that out? Well,
Yeah,
you observe, right?
yeah,
You ask questions.
yeah. And biggest question is self-inquiry. Ask about yourself. How am
Yeah.
I doing this? Because if you do self-inquisition on those cycles, everything begins to fall apart.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. It's and when you and just the opposite happens when you do the other. It coalesces in this wonderful symmetry, apparently, right? That just it brings that sense of awe, right? Because everything is working, maybe not to its full capacity. However, it's greatly increased, and happy people get more done with less supervision and will exceed your expectations every time. True?
yeah, yeah.
How do we do that? How do we create happy people? How do we don't create. How do we invite people to be more happy?
Well, we're kind of the blind people out there with a cane, tapping around the woodwork, saying, "Are you it? Are you it? Are you it?" And
Right, right.
eventually, you ask that question enough times, and people start asking you, "Are you it? Are you it?" Said, "I can only help you see your experiences. I'm not going to tell you what to do or how to do it. You've got to make that decision for yourself. Because otherwise, if I try to take over your experiences, I'm just playing my ego."
Yeah. Well, it's like, what is it? The masters can point where to look, but not what to see. That's up to you. And in this, how would you anticipate um, on a daily basis? Because we're kind of running towards the end here. It's been a wonderful conversation. We can talk for hours, right? It's how would you recommend that people on a personal level could advance themselves with a simple activity on a daily basis?
The starting place for anything is focus on your breath. Breathe in, breathe out, see what that does for you. The joke on that is breathe in, breathe out, repeat if necessary. So,
Right,
yeah,
because we breathe unconsciously.
yeah. So if you can move from unconscious breathing to conscious breathing, that's a huge leap. A lot of people don't understand.
And this is exactly what Jung was after.
Yeah, and then you start going, okay, I can be conscious of my breathing. What's conscious of my thoughts going to be? So you have thoughts come in and out like about a million times a second. So which ones are you holding? Which ones are you focused on? And then what are those thoughts producing in terms of emotions? How's that happening? And then ask yourself the question, who's doing all that? And when you get a better answer, keep looking. Who's doing all that?
Mhm.
Keep looking, keep looking. And then you eventually you get back into who you are and you realize that's just a state of being. It's not necessarily a state of doing.
I'm going to breathe that one in. That's wonderful. Greg, this has just been wow. Um, Such a pleasure, such an honor to have this conversation with you, and even more so to be able to share it with others and have the impact that I know that it will on our audience. So I
And
thank you very much.
and ditto from me, Zen. I really enjoyed this conversation a lot. You ask great questions.
Well, thank you. You got to have guys like you to be able to ask those kinds of questions. Otherwise, those questions don't come up. Those are the things that fall in, right? It's like I'm
Yeah,
listening. It's like, okay, how can I make this better?
yeah,
Can I show, how can I help you shine? And that reflection, not just me, but for the audience as well. It's a tremendous gift and blessing, and I am so humbled and honored by it every moment of these kinds of conversations.
yeah.
You it compels me to be my best.
As I like to tell people, I'm still doing repeat as necessary.
Yeah, me too. Yeah, it's that breathing. You got to go back to it. Well, thank you again, Greg.
Thank you.
I look forward to crossing paths again soon.
We will. We
I'm
will.
sure. Great.
All right.
Namaste and in catch. And thank you all for sticking with us for this episode of One World in a New World. I know you've got some amazing information and applicable practices for your own lives. We'll see you next time. Have a great day.